Are going to continue today to talk about the impacts of imperialism. We're going to deal now in section 5.2.2 about how in the advent of imperialism we're going to get some new states that will rise, or maybe states that had long been in existence that will grow in power and stature because they will start taking part in the imperialist game. And some states won't play the game or won't play the game as well, and they'll be finding themselves in decline. So just continuing this idea that when in the era of imperialism, there's going to be winners and there's going to be losers. And we'll talk first about one of the biggest winners of the age of imperialism, and that's going to be the nation of Japan. If you guys recall from our last era, we talked about Japan in the early 1600s, coming under the consolidation of the Tokugawa shogunate. Tokugawa Ieyasu, remember him? Who made a move to drive out foreign influence, to limit trade with Europeans to only one port in Nagasaki, to drive out Christian missionaries, to essentially close the doors of Japan to the outside world. All right? And so Japan had become starkly isolationist since the rise of the Tokugawa shogunate in the early 1600s. That will come crashing down in the latter half of the 19th century. In 1853, it really all began with Commodore Matthew Perry, an American naval officer, arriving on the shores of Japan with a newly constructed American steamship fleet, essentially showing off what the United States is now producing with our Navy. And remember, our Navy paled in comparison in 1853. Our Navy paled in comparison to the Navy of the British Empire, for example. But even so, when Japan sees the American Navy arrive in 1853, led by this Commodore Matthew Perry, they've got to have in their minds what happened to the Chinese in the 1840s when the British Navy went to China. What happened in the 1840s when the British Navy went to China? The Opium War, right? Where China attempted to keep the British at bay, right? Attempted, like they had done for centuries, to keep British and keep European trade at bay, keep it at the coast, control it. But then Britain began bringing and importing opium into China. This was detrimental to Chinese society and culture, so the Chinese emperor put a halt on the opium trade and importation into China, and Britain said, no, we're not going to have that. And they brought their navy to China in the 1840s, and this is the Opium War, which blew open the doors of China. And now China was forced to sign a series of unequal treaties with Britain and later other European nations. Japan, with the arrival of Commodore Perry, initially suffers from the same fate. So as they don't have their cities bombarded by an American Navy, they begin to enter into their own unequal treaties with the United States. But this is quickly recognized by some leaders in Japan that this system cannot continue to exist, or the Japanese will continue to be exploited, much like the Chinese are on the Asian mainland. So, Japan moves to westernize themselves. And this is known as the Meiji Restoration. M-E-I-J-I. The Meiji Restoration, 1868. Japanese elites will overthrow the shogun and restore the Meiji Emperor, Emperor Meiji. M-E-I-J-I, yes?
Why do you call it restoration? Like the Meiji,
It's essentially the restoration of the authority of the emperor over the shogun.
Then how did they choose an emperor?
That is a good question, and this goes beyond my expertise. I think it's still connected to family lines from earlier emperors that ruled, but during the Tokugawa shogunate, the emperor was like very much pushed to the side. This is the restoration of the emperor as the preeminent figure in Japan. With the Meiji Restoration, and guys, we can see a picture of an issuing of a Meiji Constitution. And as you look at these military figures and the emperor himself, and you see how they are dressed and you see how they are looking, what do we see? They're westernized, okay? Western clothes, the women are in Western-style dresses. The Meiji Restoration is the westernization, or the beginning of the westernization of Japan. We're going to have a few things that are going to happen with the Meiji Restoration. Of course, there's going to be the industrialization of Japan. Railways will be constructed. Steamships will be constructed. The new Meiji rule in Japan is going to try to squash out the old vestiges of Japanese feudalism that kept Japan back in a bygone era. So the class of the samurai, those samurai that had long been existing in Japan as a warrior elite, the samurai class will be abolished. No more samurai in Japan. No more warrior elite in Japan. Now, that doesn't mean all of the people that were once samurai will be, like, killed off. Some of them will. Some samurai will be like, whoa, 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 we are not cool with these changes, and we are going to rise up in rebellion against this new empire, because this is threatening our very existence. So there will be a samurai rebellion. Contrary to what Hollywood says, Tom Cruise did not go there to help them fight. If you guys saw the film The Last Samurai, that's probably before your time. Okay. Anyway, the samurai did rebel against this new industrialization because it threatened their own existence. Because remember, what does an industrialized military mean?
You got guns.
You've got guns. And what do guns do to samurai's swords?
Shoot them down. Kill them.
It neutralizes them. You don't have to get close to these samurai anymore. So the samurai class will be abolished. Now, this does not mean that all samurai were rebelling against these new ideas. Some, rather than like beating them or attempting to beat them, just joined it. And many old samurai, the old samurai warrior elite, became the new industrial elite in Japan. All right, they just kind of changed hats. They got Western-style haircuts, they put on Western-style clothes, and they became the leaders, in some cases, of Japanese industry. So the samurai class is gone. Japan will now establish a conscripted Western-style army, a professional army of citizen soldiers, just like we had in Western Europe, just like we had in the United States. Again, this neutralizes the importance of those old warrior elites. And in 1895, Japan will put that army to the test. Here's a picture of what Japan would have looked like in the end of the 19th century. And this city street, wouldn't look very much different from any city street maybe in the western United States, like in San Francisco, like with newly constructed buildings and such in the late 19th century. In 1895, the Japanese are going to fight a war against China called the Sino-Japanese War, or the First Sino-Japanese War. And Japan will defeat China. So now look what China's dealing with, guys. Not only did Britain blow the doors open to Chinese trade in the 1840s, now by the 1890s, even Japan is defeating China in war. We are nearing the end of dynastic rule in China. We're only a couple decades away from that at this point. Yes, ma'am? How did they pay for it? Well, the new Meiji government is going to pay for things the way all governments pay for things. They're going to collect taxes from landowners. They're going to be getting loans from foreign investors. So they're running themselves as a modern government. Now they're absolutely willing to trade. Japan does what China was never willing to do. China wants to remain isolated and tries to keep the Europeans and Americans out. Japan says, hey, if you can't beat them, join them. And Japan starts doing business with the West. In fact, Japan starts doing so much business with the West, they will send Japanese emissaries to Germany, for example, to learn how to establish schools, because the Germans had the best educational system seen in the world. The kindergarten that you guys go to, it's a little garden where you grow children. That's a German word, right? And the Germans were seen as having the finest schools. Many Japanese leaders of industry went to the United States and saw how American industry was established. Some would even come to the Detroit area and look at American modern factories in the early 20th century and say, yeah, we should kind of do it like this. So they absolutely were willing to do business with the West. Yes, sir?
I thought Europe had the most advanced factories in this area.
America is picking up steam in the late and early 20th century. Remember, it was American Henry Ford. Europe absolutely had factories. Henry Ford developed the assembly line in the early 20th century, where now the product moves between the workers. So that is going to be an advancement that will be incorporated into Japan. Yes?
So Japan used to have a dynastic cycle a long time ago, right?
It was Japan is a little different from China, and there's a lot more chaos going on in Japan. Feudalism in Japan lasted longer than it would last in China. No one government was able to strongly centralize Japan like they could China until the Tokugawa shogunate. Somebody, tell me why. Why is Japan so much easier to centralize than Japan? Strike that. Why is China so much easier to centralize than China? Why is China so much easier to centralize than India? That was a joke. Why is China so much more easily centralized than India? Now I can't even do it.
You okay?
You know, I don't think I am. I got a lot on my mind right now. Why is China an easier state to centralize than a place like Japan? Okay, Japan is made up of literally hundreds and hundreds of islands. Okay, four main ones. But it's harder to keep it centralized when you're an island nation. Think back to the classical period and the decentralized Greek city-states compared to a place like, well, China in that age. All right? Yes, sir?
They had a really strong bureaucratic rules like Confucian.
And they've got an earlier and stronger Confucian tradition. Now the Tokugawa shogunate is able to squash a lot of the lords and establish control. The Meiji Restoration brings that to an end. In 1904, though, and here's the coup de grace for the Japanese, and that's what this picture represents. In 1904, the Japanese will enter into a war with the Russian Empire called the Russo-Japanese War. This is an Asian nation going to war against a modern and advanced, but not as modern or as advanced as other Western European nations, a modern and advanced European white nation. Whoa. The Russo-Japanese War, 1904 and 1905. Russia versus Japan. And Japan wins. Japan, okay, beating China is one thing, but China was on the decline and it was being pushed around by everybody. But now the Japanese have defeated Russia, a major power of Europe in the early 20th century. Japan is now a world power, all right? Japan, don't write this down, just hear it because we're going to talk about it later. Japan will, of course, join the Allied powers in World War I in fighting against Germany. They will fight against German possessions in Asia. And then, of course, by 1931, Japan will be invading Manchuria and conquering that. By 1937, Japan actually invades mainland China. By 1941, from 1939 to 1941, Japan is going to expand its empire throughout the Pacific, including the French colonies in Indochina, including Vietnam. And in December of 1941, Japan will attack the United States. So Japan now is a major player. And look at how fast they did it. 1860s Meiji Restoration, right? 40 years after that, they're defeating a major European power in Russia. 40 years after that, they're on the verge of conquering the entire Pacific realm. Yes?
It's also worth noting that the Japanese also opened up the military for Prussian advisors.
Absolutely, yeah.
The military is trained by the West, basically.
Very good. It's a Western trained and Western modeled military. The Japanese, I said they went to Germany to learn how to set up schools. They talked to American industrialists. They talked to the Germans to establish a military. Who do you think they would go talk to about establishing a navy? Where did they get some advice? They go to the British to learn about establishing a modern navy. All right, so Japan, longtime nation, now on a global power scene, right? We've already mentioned these guys, and a lot of this harkens back to U.S. history from last year. But we are going to see during this era, 1750 to 1914, a dramatic expansion in the land empires of the United States and Russia. First, the United States. We're going to just talk about this briefly because this is like a quarter of the study in AP US history. We know we started here, and then France sold us Louisiana, right? And then we fought a war against, then we gained Texas. Then we fought a war against Mexico in the 1840s and gained the American Southwest. And eventually we're going to buy Alaska in the 1860s from Russia. So the United States is going to have, what do we call that in AP US history? Stretching from coast to coast. That idea of manifest destiny. And that happens in the 19th century too. So initially when we're talking about American empire, we're talking about a land-based empire. But we want to, I don't know why we think of it differently. Like, I think in our minds we see going out and conquering overseas territories as just a different thing, and maybe some of us would view that as not as acceptable as what the United States did in the 19th century. We were conquering lands in the 19th century. There were people that lived on these lands, and we pushed right across them and took it over and stuck a flag in it and called it the USA, right? That's what we did, and that was the creation of a land-based empire in the 19th century. But we were not limited to only the continental United States or even taking Alaska. In the 19th century, the United States will also begin to exert influence over Latin America. We might remember a president named James Monroe, who is in 1823. In 1823, he will state that the Western Hemisphere is outside of European aggression. Europeans, keep your aggression in Europe. The Western Hemisphere is our backyard and we're not going to play your games. This is called the Monroe Doctrine, keeping the European powers out of the West. Now, obviously, we've already talked, the United States will fight a war against Mexico. So we're totally cool fighting a war against Mexico. We just want the Europeans to steer clear of Latin America, all right? The United States is also going to get involved in other Latin American states, all right? By the early 20th century, President Theodore Roosevelt is going to add to the Monroe Doctrine. What you learned last year was called the Roosevelt Corollary. Does this ring a bell? The Roosevelt Corollary, the Roosevelt addition to the Monroe Doctrine, which basically says, not only do we want European powers to stay out of issues in Latin America, but we have the right, we say, to intervene. If there's anything going on in Latin America, whether it's European powers or local squabbles, that could threaten American interests in Latin America. So, for example, the United States will begin to support the independence of Panama. Now, it's kind of weird, but Colombia used to be an oddly shaped nation. Colombia, down in South America, used to have Panama as a part of it. You guys remember this from last year, right? Well, why did the United States have an interest in Panama?
Canal.
Very good. It was the narrowest strip that we could dig a trench from the Caribbean Sea into the Pacific Ocean. We could connect Atlantic to Pacific. Why is it so crucial to connect Atlantic to Pacific?
Shorter route.
Very good. Now you don't have to go, if you want to go from New York to San Francisco, you don't have to go around the Tierra del Fuego, the southern tip of South America. You can go cut through the middle. So it was huge for us, and we wanted that. So we would push the Panamanians to declare, you guys should be independent. You shouldn't have the Colombians dominating you. You should be your own nation. And we will support that endeavor if we can have the claim on this little strip of land here so we can dig a canal. And eventually that canal will be dug, and it's finished by the early 19-teens. Yes, sir?
So do we still own Panama?
No. This is going to be something we'll talk about in your senior year. In the 1970s, don't write this down, but President Jimmy Carter, wanting to build some better relations with Latin American countries, worked out an agreement with the Panamanians to, by the 1990s, give the Panama Canal back to Panama. This was hugely unpopular, and part of the reason why Jimmy Carter would lose the 1980 presidential election, but Panama Canal is now back in Panamanian hands. Yes?
And also during this period, like you're saying, like how he wants to help Panama gain its independence.
Yeah.
Well, you can't really argue that it was that the U.S. was actually advocating for independence because of what they will gain through Canada. And also, Canada didn't really have a choice. They couldn't really declare that.
Sure, absolutely. We were going to get what we ultimately wanted out of that deal. So yes, when we say independence, let's like float those quotes around that word independence, because they're not truly going to be independent. Also, in 1898, the United States will enter into war with Spain. It's called the Spanish-American War, because we're making things easy on, right? The Sino-Japanese War is China and Japan. The Russo-Japanese War is Russia and Japan. The Spanish-American War is Spain and the United States. We call wars by such better names in the late 19th, early 20th century, right? Yeah. Not these like 100 years wars or 30 years war where you don't really know who's even fighting in them. Now we have wars that are really clear, right? In 1898, the United States begins a war with Spain. And through the course of that war, we're not going to talk much about it, but it's going to enhance the American empire as the United States will take from Spain in this war the island of Puerto Rico. We will take in the Pacific an island called Guam. We will take control of the archipelago of the Philippines. You guys know that word, archipelago? It's like a collection of islands. We'll take over the Philippines. And we will even stake claim to a naval base on Cuba called Guantanamo Bay, which is still very much in the news these days, because that's where we send the people that we capture in the war on terror, because we don't want to bring them to the mainland United States. So the United States, Puerto Rico and Guam and Philippines. And then a chunk of Cuba. We'll talk more about the Philippines in a few minutes. Let's look at Russia. We've already seen this map, but we can see here the expansion of Russia through the centuries. What I care about here is our time period, around 1750 through the 19th century. And so we're going to look at some of this red stuff. Russia will be pushing into the Black Sea. Okay, Black Sea over here. Russia will also be gaining some land in the east. All right, this peninsula is going to come under some threat in that Russo-Japanese War. This green stuff, 1855 to 1881, we see Russia pushing into Manchuria and taking this island called Sakhalin. You don't need to write that down, just hear it. These are lands that Russia will be losing to Japan, or at least part of that island, losing to Japan in the Russo-Japanese War. All right? So the southern half of it. So Russia is going to be tremendously expanding, but Russian expansion is going to be stopped ultimately and pushed back a little bit by now the growing Japan. And that's where the United States, we can pat ourselves on the back for being as wonderful as we think we are. But remember, do not ever forget that one advantage that the United States has over virtually every other nation on the planet, certainly the other great powers of the 19th and early 20th century, is geography, 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 right? We've got a Pacific Ocean to our west, an Atlantic Ocean to our east, a comparatively weak Mexico to our south, and a comparatively weak Canada to our north. The United States is in a pristine position for massive growth in the 20th century. All right? We will join in major wars in the 20th century, of course, but we don't fight them in our own territory. We fight them on other people's territory, and that's a lot better way to fight a war. All right. Another country that will suffer at the expense of other growing industrial powers is the Ottoman Empire. Now, we've already mentioned that the Ottoman Empire has been in slow decline since the 1600s. Why has the Ottoman Empire been in slow decline since the 1600s? Farah. Very good. When the Portuguese and then the Spanish find new ways to the riches of the East without going through Ottoman lands, that is Ottoman trade resources being diminished. All right? Ottoman Empire is going to be bringing in less money. By the 19th century, the Ottoman decline is so great that some territories that had long been a part of the Ottoman Empire since the 1500s are going to start pushing for their own independence. We're going to talk in a few more minutes about a concept that is born in the 19th century called nationalism. But we want to have that in our mind now and through the end of the study of AP World. Nationalism is I like to think of two types of nationalism, all right? There is the I'm an American and I love the United States kind of nationalism. I love, it's kind of like patriotism. I've got a country, I love my country, and I want my country to be strong and to continue to be strong. Yay, nationalism. Now, sometimes nationalism gets pretty freaky. The 20th century shows us that some nationalism gets pretty scary. Like when you say, I love my country, and I want my country to be great and strong. I want my country to be strong at the expense of others. Like, my country's strength can only be shown if I can diminish my neighbors. If I elevate, this is what we might call ultra-nationalism. If I put my country on such a pedestal at the expense of neighbors, all right? My country is great, hence your country is nothing, and I have the right to push around your country. That kind of scared us in the 20th century. That's one type of nationalism. Hey, I'm French, and we have now a French country where we have, after the French Revolution, we haven't even talked about that yet, we will soon, we have French citizens rather than French subjects, American citizens rather than American subjects, British citizens rather than British subjects. A subject of a king is beholden to a king and a king's whims. A citizen has rights. Yes?
I don't think the British are called citizens yet because, like, on the passport, my teachers usually show me, and they're like the subject, a subject of the royal whatever.
Yeah,
they're still technically.
But, remember the king in England starting in 1215 began to have his power chipped away. By the 19th century, the Queen of England in the 19th century is Queen Victoria. She's still a powerful queen. But Parliament is really running the show. This is a constitutional monarchy by the 19th century. But, well, even earlier than that. If the Queen of England told a British citizen or subject of hers today to go conquer that land for me, the person might say, yeah, Queen, I'm not sure we're listening to that anymore. All right, so I think it's a little bit different in that sense. So anyway, the Ottoman Empire still has subjects. The Ottoman Empire in the early 19th century is ruling as essentially an absolute monarchy with the Sultan at the head. All right? But by the 19th century, a second kind of nationalism is on the rise. Of people that don't have a country. Like the French people, yay, we're France, we have a country, we love our country. But what about all these people of the world that don't have a country yet? What about the Egyptians who are being dominated by Ottoman Turks? All right? Or what about these people in Southeastern Europe, like the Serbs, who are being dominated by the Ottoman Turks? Or the Greeks, who are not Ottoman Turks, and who are not Muslims, and don't feel a connection with the Ottoman Empire, and they want a country of their own. And so this other kind of nationalism begins to grow in the 19th century, of peoples who are ethnically, or culturally, or religiously, or language related to each other, but they don't have a country of their own. And they want a country of their own, like everybody else gets to have a country of their own. And so we're going to see a rise in nationalist movements in the 19th century. The Greeks will gain their independence from the Ottoman Empire. Eventually the Serbs will gain independence from the Ottoman Empire. The Egyptians will gain independence from the Ottoman Empire. All right? We're going to start seeing different peoples within the Ottoman Empire assert their own authority. And so the Ottoman Empire will be chipped away. All right? And we can see here, some lands are being lost by 1830. Some lands being lost throughout the 1800s. Many more being lost in the early 20th century. The Ottoman Empire is on decline. Does anybody recall the name that some referred to as the Ottoman Empire? Referred to the Ottoman Empire as?
The sick man in Europe.
The sick man of Europe. Very good. They're on the decline. Now, why are they on the decline? Because in the early 19th century, kind of the same thing we saw with some samurai in Japan. The old elite of the Ottoman Empire, the military elite especially. Remember what we called these guys?
Vizier.
Well, the vizier is like the bureaucratic leader. The janissary. I'm sorry, I thought I heard it back there. The janissary corps. Remember these young Christian boys were taken and they were raised to become either military or bureaucratic elite? What's Dev Sherman. And this Janissary Corps, these were like the military leaders. They had the great estates. They had the power because they had the army behind them, right? And they didn't want to give that up. Modernizing, westernizing, being able to resist a lot of the pressures from Western Europe, that really relied on creating a modern Western military. But a modern Western military would take away the traditional power of this Janissary Corps. So they resisted it. Now, eventually we're going to talk about the Ottoman Empire offering some of their own reforms, but it's going to be too little, too late for the Ottoman Empire. Good? Good. Yes. We will see also for the Ottoman Empire, pressure, like I just mentioned, the United States was in a great position literally because of its location. The Ottoman Empire is originally in a tremendous position to reap the benefits of global trade because it's at the meeting point of 3 continents, right? Europe and Asia and Africa. Well, by the 19th century, the Ottoman Empire is getting pressure from all sides. It's getting pressure from the European powers and a growing, for example, Austrian Empire. It's getting pressure in Africa as Britain is going to want Egypt more than anything else. Because Britain is going to see in Egypt the narrowest point, the narrowest strip of land between the Mediterranean Sea and the Red Sea. Because the Red Sea, if you get into the Red Sea, that connects you into the Arabian Sea, which connects you into the Indian Ocean, which gets you to the riches of India, which is the crown jewel of the British Empire. So Britain wants Egypt, because that is where Britain can dig a canal called the Suez. Britain and France are going to get together and dig a canal called the Suez Canal. They do that by the 1860s. So Britain wants Egypt. So the Ottoman Empire's got pressure in its south. And then you've got a growing Russia. We already talked about an expanding Russia, right? You've got a growing Russia that's putting pressure on the Ottoman Empire. So the Ottoman Empire is now being squeezed on all sides. In the 1850s, another war will be fought. This one doesn't have as helpful a name for us. It's called the Crimean War. The Crimea is this peninsula. I like to think of the Crimean Peninsula as the uvula on an open mouth. If the Black Sea is an open mouth, your uvula is that little hangy ball in the back that lets you not choke when you eat. The uvula is the Crimean Peninsula. You've probably heard of this in the news of late because of the Russian-Ukraine issues in Crimea. There'll be a war fought in the 1850s on the Crimean Peninsula where the British and the French are actually going to come to the aid of the Ottoman Empire to fight against Russia. Now, the British and the French don't love the Ottoman Empire, but they are far more concerned about Russia expanding their influence. As Russia is growing, neither Britain nor France want to see Russia continue to expand all the way down into the Mediterranean Sea, because that could threaten their ability to get to India, right? So Britain and France will help the Ottomans fight the Russians, and they win. Yay. But this does not mean the Ottoman Empire is any stronger. In fact, it means quite the opposite. Britain is going to become a huge influence and power within the Ottoman Empire. We will talk much more about that when you're seniors in high school. Yes?
So, is Russia communist right now?
No, not until 1918. Okay. Not until end of 1917, 1918. All right. We will also see some empires, some kingdoms arise on the fringes of other empires. And the one that the College Board wants me to talk about, or that I've chosen to talk about, is a kingdom in southern Africa known as the Zulu Kingdom. Z-U-L-U. And this guy that you can barely make out here, his name is Shaka. S-H-A-K-A. Shaka. And Shaka is a leader of a kingdom that becomes known as the Zulu Kingdom. He organizes a powerful military amongst the Zulu people, and they will begin to grow throughout southern Africa. And you can see on this map where they begin here along the Indian Ocean, and they begin to push to the west and south from there in the north. And they're obviously pushing other tribes, right? They're defeating other tribes and they're pushing other tribes. Well, eventually, the tribes that they're pushing start to get pushed into areas that the British are saying, hey, we're here now. So this is a problem. And the rise of the Zulu will be short-lived ultimately because they will run up against an expanding British Empire. By the 1870s, the British are at war with the Zulu. It's called the AngloZulu War. So are we seeing a lot of wars in this era of imperialism? As empires are expanding or contracting, as other states want to try to gain those lands, we're seeing a lot of conflict rise. 1870s, the AngloZulu War. The Zulu will actually defeat the British in one battle. But then the British come back with more men and more guns, and they ultimately put down the Zulu tribesmen. And this brings an end to the Zulu kingdom and ultimately continuing growth of the British Empire in southern Africa. Yes?
How long did the Zulu kingdom last?
It was born in 1818, and by the end of the 1800s, it was destroyed by the British. All right. The final thing to talk about in 522 is the unification of two European powers. I've already mentioned the idea of nationalism, right? Like, hey, we all speak Italian. And hey, we're pretty much all Catholic. And hey, we have some cultural identities. We should be like one country rather than this like divided city-state kind of Italy that's been bumming around for the last few hundred years. And so in 1861, Italy is going to unify. It's going to take part in this growing tide of nationalism. And Italy will unify under one common king. And in the next decade, in 1871, Germany will do the same. Guys, I know we are not talking very deeply about this. This is the difference between AP World History and AP European History, all right? If you're interested in this kind of stuff, if you are Italian or if you are German, you have a lot more to read about these kinds of things if you care to, all right? For our purposes, we're talking about the growth of nationalism, and we see a unifying Italy, and we see in 1871 a Germany that will unify, where the great Prussian Empire of the 19th century will join with German principalities into one German empire. Yes, sir?
And this is because they won the war with France.
Yeah, this follows on the heels of a victory of Prussia over France in a war known as the Franco-Prussian War in 1870 and 71. So Germany will unite. For our purposes here, this is an example of 19th century nationalism where German-speaking people will join together in one German empire. But it also is going to upset the balance of power that had been established in Western Europe, where there was like a strong Britain and a strong France and a strong Prussia and a strong Austria and a strong Russia, and they kind of kept each other balanced. And now Germany is going to join with some economically powerful regions of Western now Germany, and Germany is going to upset that balance of power in Europe. Spoiler alert, war will be coming very soon because of this upset in the balance of power. Yes?
How come it's because of Germany, not because of Italy?
How come it's because of Germany and not because of Italy? Germany's got a lot of advantages that Italy doesn't have. Germany's got a much larger population. Germany's got a much stronger industrial base. Remember the Industrial Revolution started in England over here and then spread into Belgium and got its way into Germany. So Germany is much more industrialized. And Germany has a tradition with the Prussian Empire of already having a very powerful military. Now, Italy will be on the scene as well, but not nearly as formidable a threat in the 20th century as Germany will be. I have a question in the back, then we'll work our way up.
How long was Prussia like an empire?
Yeah, we didn't talk about it much. Prussia was a European, 1600s into the 1700s, into the 1800s. What's that?
Was Russia mad about it that they joined with Germany because of
Yeah, Prussia has nothing to do with Russia. Prussia, despite it being the same word as Russia with just a P on it, it's different. Prussians are like German speakers, and so no, they're not Russian. They're separate from there. Yes.
I think it's they were mad. Other countries were mad is because like countries like France and Britain, who were very like influential before, they preferred if the Germans were separated into small countries, they could push them around.
Yeah, makes them weaker. Absolutely.
But now since they're unified, it's gonna be harder for them to do diplomacy.
Absolutely. Yes, sir.
And also, remember when we talked about like the idea of social classes, when we talked about how this German guy established the idea of healthcare?
Well, that's out of on Bismarck, and that comes around. So Bismarck is a chancellor of the German Empire. So you have the creation of the German Empire, of which Bismarck is the chancellor, and he says, hey, I want to keep my power here, so we're going to give more people the right to vote, and we're going to create some ideas of healthcare and stuff like that to help maintain that power, to solidify the state. Almost done here. Another kind of nationalism that's not going to be as successful as German or Italian, we can see an example in Asia in what's known as Filipino nationalism. A lot of countries going on. In the 19th century, a nationalist movement will grow in the Philippines amongst Filipinos who are tired of and done with Spanish imperialism. All right? And we've already mentioned how by 1898 the United States and Spain are going to go to war with each other. Well, many Filipino nationalists see this as an opportunity to stick it to Spain and get their independence. And so some Filipino nationalists will actually be recruited by the Americans to help fight against the Spanish. Yay! High five, Filipino nationalists. Thanks a lot for the help. Upon the American victory in the Spanish-American War, though, the United States deems that the Filipinos are not fit to rule themselves. And the United States now finds itself in a war in the early 20th century against the very Filipinos who they were once supporting. And from 1899 to 1913, the United States will fight in the Philippine-American War, a war most Americans have no clue even existed. Ultimately, the Filipinos will be put down, and the United States will control the Philippines as a protectorate through the Second World War. The Philippine-American War.
Who's the president at the time? I forgot.
We're dealing with Roosevelt. No, this is much after Polk. This is Roosevelt, yeah. Yeah, we won. We won. But at tremendous costs to the Filipino people. So, with this idea of nationalism, some people are going to get it. Some people want it, but don't ultimately get their own nations. And by the 20th century, that will result in the biggest war mankind has ever fought against each other. I've got two more topics to talk about, but we're hopping into 523. How did Americans and how did British people and how did French people and how did Germans find it acceptable to do the things they were doing to the people of the world that they were conquering? Because there was massive death and destruction and conquering and ruling of native peoples in this age of imperialism. How do we justify this? Two ideas will be born in the 19th century. What do you got, Farah? Ideologies like, yes, sir?
American exceptionalism.
Okay, for the United States, American exceptionalism, sure, yes? Social Darwinism, very good. We want to make sure you guys are absolutely comfortable with the idea of social Darwinism, where the biological theories of Charles Darwin, where he says that species will survive based on their fitness to survive, and those species that aren't fit are meant to die out. So we shouldn't weep when a species goes extinct. It means it wasn't fit, and other things that are more fit will make it. Well, by the 19th century, Darwin's theories are going to be applied to the social world, to the national world. And so as we see powers like Britain or America or Germany on the rise at the expense of Africans or Southeast Asians or South Asians, many will say, well, this is just natural. This is just natural. This is science. And it just means that Europeans or Americans are more fit. We're more intellectually capable to be ruling and to dominate these people of the world. And that makes sense to people. That makes sense to modern Europeans. And so it justifies their actions. Yes, ma'am?
Did the U.S. or Europe?
This is like kind of a tag team effort. these original ideas were born, Charles Darwin was a British guy. These original ideas were born in Europe, and Europe hopped on board, but America was not far or even much behind adopting these same ideas. Some would see it as their moral obligation, and we're going to read in a couple moments a poem by a British man named Rudyard Kipling, who spent most of his life in India. He's a guy that wrote the Jungle Book. You guys familiar with Rudyard Kipling and the Jungle Book? Rudyard Kipling is going to write a poem called The White Man's Burden, where he is going to try to convince the Americans of what they need to do in the Philippines, because the British have already been doing it around the planet. So some are going to see it as a moral obligation for the stronger, more fit people of the world to take care of and help civilize the lesser people of the world. It sounds horribly distasteful today to even talk about these things, doesn't it? This is also taking place at the same time as pseudo-scientific, I'm going to say pseudo-scientific ideas, but in the 19th century it was seen as scientific, pseudo-scientific ideas of white racial supremacy.
That's what I was talking about.
In the 19th century, this is born. There's a French social theorist named Arthur de Gobineau. You guys don't need to worry about his name. But he's going to be influential to later figures like Adolf Hitler himself. Arthur de Gobineau writes a work where he divides the human world into races based on their skin color. There's white races, according to him, and black races, and yellow races. And the white race is the only race that has the intellectual capacity to create beautiful things, says Arthur de Gobineau. And these lesser races are meant to be dominated by the white races. So these are Europeans, and these are Western Europeans, and these are Americans. And other races, according to Arthur de Gobineau, should be separated. Because if you allow the mixing of races, what eventually happens to the white race?
Goes away.
It will be tampered with. It will be distorted by other races mixing with it. And we are not a far leap from Adolf Hitler moving to eliminate the Jewish race from Europe. All right? So social Darwinism, ideas of racial white supremacy are driving a lot of the justification for imperialism. All right?